Hey everyone, thanks for joining me again tonight. Sorry about the delay on the video. I tried to shoot a couple of them and was just having a hard time getting through them. And then I actually did have a complete one and I was an idiot and accidentally deleted it. So here we go again. I hope everyone had a good Christmas and we're between Christmas now and the New Year's. But I basically just kind of wrote part monologue, part essay, just to kind of give everyone an overview of what I'm thinking and where I'm at and where I happen to fall on politics. So I'm just going to jump right to it. I started off with a quote from the Gulag Archipelago. For several centuries, we have had a proverb: don't fear the law, fear the judge. But in my opinion, the law has outstripped the people, and people have lagged behind in cruelty. It's time to reverse the proverb: don't fear the judge, fear the law. I was going to do a video about September Anderson's commentary on CBC's 180 about Canadians not deserving to have any black women on our money. But when I started to research it, it led me down a rabbit hole of inconclusive research that simply just couldn't be vetted, pertaining to the deep cultural divide amongst racial groups in Canada. Stats Canada just does not collect the ethnic information that we're accustomed to, especially that we see in the United States when it comes to Chicago and Detroit and DC and all the major cities down there. Most of the stuff that I noticed that she had quoted was HuffPo articles. So where they got the information, I don't know. I couldn't check it. But it made me think of the dangers of what pursuing this line of accusations will cause. Everybody wants affirmative action, yet nobody wants the consequence of their actions. Opportunity of outcome is always more important than equality of opportunity. Everybody wants a racial, gender, gay, disabled, trans, all that parity in Parliament, yet no one seems to care about meritocracy. It's not anything to do. I haven't heard anyone complain that there are no representatives from any of the territories. No one seems to care about that. They don't care about any kind of parity or equality unless it comes to these minority groups. So it seems kind of ridiculous. Instead of hiring the people that are qualified, they only care what color they are and they only care what gender they are. Freedom of speech has been stripped away. The thought police are becoming a frightening reality, yet the hypocrisy of the left wing fascists, with their stands on silencing the majority, yet demanding we use their pronouns in compelled speech, requires a kind of doublethink that would make George Orwell turn over in his grave. Now, bias do exist. I'm not going to deny that. They do. And there are probably still, well, not probably, there are still racists that exist that hate people because of where they're from or the color of their skin. But this picture being painted of conservatives and Christians to be these racist, sexist, bigoted homophobes and xenophobia, who has a general fear of nothing? It's preposterous. These are all buzzwords that are designed to shut people up. And it comes back to more of this restriction on free speech. The most conservatives, myself included, we don't think that way. All I care about is small government. I want the government out of my life. I don't want them in my wallet. I don't want them in my relationships. I don't want them in my communities. I want them as little as possible because I really do believe that for the most part, people are good at heart. But they tend to regulate things to the sky, and it's pointless. The less government, the better, because the more control the government gets, the worse of a job they do. They're bad at everything they do. Those very people, mainly the conservatives and Christians, who you claim to be racist, sexist, bigoted, homophobic, xenophobes, are the same people who went to war and died for your freedom. For you to be a whiny little petulant child. Now, I've talked to my brother about this because he's fairly like-minded, but I'm convinced that the reason we're going down this road is because all the good men died. Don't get me wrong, there are several out there, but during World War II, we lost a lot of good men. And these people weren't around to be the fathers and teach their kids how to be men. And I think that's where this all started, was the war. We lost so many good men, and then we have a generation of younger people growing up without direction. And it's been a trickle-down effect ever since both world wars. Systemic racism is no more than a buzzword in today's era. The injustices of the past were blots on the history of mankind. If we know one thing, it will happen again. History always repeats itself, and it will, and you're already seeing it starting to happen. I'm convinced that it is human nature to be at conflict, because it is overcoming trials and hardships that ultimately motivate people and develop individuals and their character. This social justice movement is proof of that. If you honestly believe that things are horrible and unjust today, how would you have lived 50 years ago? Yet there is more animosity amongst young people, and especially the millennials, than the older generation who lived through suffrages. I know several people, especially because of my line of work in healthcare, that actually lived through the Depression. And they're just thankful for what they have. This entitled generation now that's growing up are whining about things that they shouldn't be whining about. And it's because they've had it so good. Until you've been hungry, until you've been homeless, until you've really had to suffer, you can't understand. And I've had times in my past where I was very poor. Luckily enough, I went back to school and I got an education. I do all right now. But I've lived in a house in the winter where I didn't have any heat or hydro. I've been there. I've been through the suffrages. And I can tell you that going to college is a walk in the park. And these trigger words and stuff that people are saying, words can't hurt you. They physically can't hurt you. Yeah, they may hurt your feelings, but you need to toughen up. That's all there is to it. Social justice is a cancer on society that cannibalizes its own and only offers more strife and conflict instead of real solutions. If you don't believe that's true, then why is it when someone says they don't see color, they're instantly attacked? If this utopian human society did exist, where race, gender, sexual orientation, and disabilities were all treated equally and without any prejudice, could you still say then, treat me fairly, but recognize me as I am? No, I think everything would be kind of gray in that regard. You don't want to be seen as a color or to be seen as a gender, but you want special treatment. So my perfect example of this is the LGBTQ plus community. They want equality and everything, but they still have a big pride parade. And I remember a couple years ago when Rob Ford, the former mayor of Toronto, don't get me wrong, he had his issues, but he was refusing to go to the pride parade, and it was the end of the world. If equality is to be reached, then this parade that separates you, that is this big to-do about sexual orientation, it needs to go. There's no straight parade. It's not a matter of anything. I don't care what people do in their life, but they want to be recognized, but they want to be equal. You can't be equal and have special treatment. It's one or the other. This utopian world that I was talking about, where everything is equal, would have to be a world of people that are blind, deaf, and mute. There's no other way around it, because there will always be conflict otherwise. Western society, as it is the most prosperous and best system that has ever existed in recorded history. Yet, Che Guevara worshipping, Fidel Castro idolizing people want socialism to rule. This is the best and fastest way to ensure the destruction of any civilization. I've heard time and time again that communism is ideologically a great system, but it's never been done properly. That's because it can't be done properly. It never will be. Giving the government more power never ends well. And even when I was in college, I remember coming home and being, socialism's great or communism is great, because I was indoctrinated into this stuff. I went to high school and was told this stuff, and I've always been a conservative and I stood up against it, but I just didn't have the arsenal of weapons that I needed to argue against this. I just didn't have the knowledge, and they don't teach it. They don't teach it at all. So how are you supposed to know? When you go to school and you're brought up in a liberal education from the time you're in kindergarten and you're indoctrinated into this basically cult of leftism, how do kids know? unless their parents are able to teach them. But when you send your kid to public school, they spend more time around their peers and around their teachers than they spend with you. And unless you're really on top of it parenting, or you're sending your kids to a private school that's based in conservatism, they're going to wind up braying this jackassery because this is all they're taught. I just heard on the news the other day that they did a study, and like 97% of professors in post-secondary education places are all liberal. So how is that an even and fair, balanced thing? And in Canada especially, we've got the CBC, which is the juggernaut of all the broadcasters in Canada, and it's government funded. $1.5 billion goes from the government, and they've never been fair. If anyone thinks that CBC is objective, they're crazy. It just doesn't exist. So this is what we grow up in. We hear it in school, we hear it on the radio, we see it on the news. How are kids supposed to know a difference when no one's taking the time to teach them anything else? And it's not really their fault because they're being indoctrinated. And I've been looking at news outlets over the last few days, especially. Like, I know it's been Christmas and Parliament shut down, so it's been a fairly slow news cycle. But there's nothing on there. Like, I was listening to Sirius XM radio. Can Talks was all about celebrities and all about mice and this and that. And then I flipped over to the CBC and they were talking about slow journalism and some guy that's doing a foot trek across Africa and trying to work his way around along the ancient migration patterns. I've heard interviews about all kinds of stuff. We've had celebrity deaths over the last week, and that seems to be the top of it. And really, I was really frustrated by this celebrity worship. Carrie Fisher, I'm sure you've all heard, passed away, and she played Princess Leia in the Star Wars, the original Star Wars. And that's all I've heard about. It's been dominating the news cycle. It's the top story on, and I'm not just talking in Canada, I'm talking in the States too. Why is this such a thing? Like, it's a sad thing when someone dies, but why is it a top news story? The only other thing I've been hearing about is Barack Obama and his government not vetoing this UN proposition against Israel. It's been a top news story, but it's been dominated by celebrities. I was watching the news tonight. CTV Ottawa. The number one story was a local cyclist got hit and died, which is very sad. And then there was another story about a 9-year-old boy who broke his leg, so he wasn't able to play minor hockey for a couple weeks. And then Carrie Fisher was on there. And then they talked about some of the new changes that are going to be going through Parliament in 2017, which you should really look into because cap and trade is going to be there. They're removing the 8% portion of the federal portion of hydro on your hydro bills, but then they're implementing cap and trade. They're cutting a bunch of other stuff. But that was like buried down the news cycle. The very first story that they opened with was 2 people dying, which is always sad. It is always sad. But if that's the national news story or the local Ottawa story, that's the first thing we hear, and then it's buried further down. If I wasn't actually interested or looking for it, I would have changed the channel long before I ever heard anything about it. And the more I listen to it, like you listen to Sirius XM, they've got POTUS, they've got Fox, they've got MSNBC, CNN, HLN, you name all these different groups that talk about news all the time and pay attention to the issues. Canadian politics is just buried. Anything you listen to, there's really nothing good. Unless you're listening to a local station. Like, I live in a rural area, so I can't actually get it on the regular radio. I know there are local talk radios that talk about politics and conservative ones. But it's not easy for everyone to access unless you specifically know what you're looking for and you're looking for it on the internet. It's just not there. And I don't think it's so much that the Canadian public is apathetic about this stuff. I really don't. It's just that they hide all of this information from the Canadian people. It's not out there. It's not an open discussion like it is in the States. Everything that's done in the States is monitored and talked about, and there's commentaries and there's critiques and there's debates. It just doesn't happen in Canada. And I think keeping the Canadian public in the dark is one of the most powerful tools the government has because, like I said in that opening statement, they can just force these rules through without anyone even knowing, and then by the time we know that the law has been passed, it's too late. We're screwed by it. And it's a really sad system, and there's nobody keeping them accountable for this stuff. There's that old adage that the best thing the devil did was convince the world he didn't exist. And the Canadian government's kind of doing the same thing. Oh, we're not doing much in Parliament. You know, you don't need to worry about it. We're in control. We've got it. There's nothing major going. And then bang, something happens that changes our lives. And by the time it's through, it's too late because there is no avenue to get it out there. And I think that's really got to be a shift and a change in Canada as far as the politics go. And especially the more we get involved with world politics, I think the UN is a horrible, horrible governmental organization. And I don't think any government, UN especially, that's a board of these other people, has the right to build or sanction or pass laws that affect individual countries. Like this whole carbon taxing that we're talking about ultimately started in the UN. And they're actually putting in policies that are affecting individual countries. And this is stuff that they subscribe to. And it's not right. We live in individual countries for that reason. And this globalist scheme is not a good thing because it's hard enough keeping one country together. There's so many different opinions. Worldwide, it's impossible. And especially since you look at most of these places, the UN is mainly dominated by a lot of Islamic countries that just don't have the social rights records that the big democracies have. I think Canada and the US and Britain and Europe need to stick together. But until these other, like Iran is on the UN Security Council, they have a horrible human rights record. Absolutely horrible. And they're sanctioning these countries. Like right now, the world is just picking on Israel. Now, when I was younger, I used to think that Israel was an ally because of Judaism and Christianity being so closely tied together. But that's not it at all. That's not it at all. And that's not why the world needs to stand behind Israel. The world needs to stand behind Israel because it's the beacon of hope in the Middle East. It is the only truly democratic country over there, and it's setting a precedent that it can be done in that geographical area. And the world is just pushing them around and bullying them, and you've got people sanctioning them and slapping them all the time. Palestine is launching rockets at them, and they've got the Iron Dome to try and intercept as many as they can. Hamas is shooting these rockets from underneath schools and underneath hospitals. And if Israel ever retaliates, then they're the ones getting slapped on the hand by the UN and being chastised by the US. And what are they supposed to do? They just sit there and take it at any time they do anything to stop it. And the world is just against them. Why are we ganging up on the only democracy that's over there? This needs to be the example and spread out. And I think until these Islamic countries come to the conclusion that the rest of us have, whether you're religious or secular, there was a clear separation of church and state here in the United States, here in Canada, over in Britain. And that's why we're able to rule our countries as freely and as democratically as we can. Because the state law is a state law and the religious law is the religious law, but it is superseded always by the legislature. In these Islamic countries, there is no separation of mosque and state. The state is run by mosque laws. And when there's Sharia law being run by a religious group of any sort, making the laws and determining the laws, it's always going to be biased against the rest. So until Iran, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, until they separate their mosque and state and become true democracies and clean up their human rights record, I don't think that they should be having a voice in the world stage. And especially when it comes to sanctioning places like Israel. They're standing behind Assad in Syria, who's a cruel, cruel dictator. Nobody's saying anything about that. Millions of Syrian refugees are on the run right now, and they're worried about Israelis building bathrooms on their houses in Jerusalem. It seems like completely backwards. And this is what they're focused on. This is the problem with the left, because it's all about social justice. And it's got nothing to do with individual justice. And they will walk over any democracy for any dictatorship at any turn they can, just because they can. This is social justice to them. And it's so hypocritical, it's sad. communism always fails because it's a horrible system, and I touched on this. If you or I or anyone now was in communist Germany or Soviet Russia in the 1940s, it's a scary, scary thought. But most people, and especially the social justice warriors as well, would all either be Nazis or you would be SS soldiers right now. And it seems preposterous and you can hold it up on values, but when you're indoctrinated into this from birth, it's true. And it's scary, but it's true. I'm going to quote the Gulag Archipelago again on this one. And it says, "Let the reader who expects this book to be a political expose slam its covers shut right now. If only it were so simple. If only there were evil people somewhere insidiously committing evil deeds, and it were necessary only to separate them from the rest of us and destroy them. But the line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being, and who is willing to destroy his own heart?" And I think that's so true. Evil isn't so black and white when you're indoctrinated to believe it. And that's just how it is. You're born in it. That's how it is. It's hard to get out unless you have someone that's instructing you and teaching you to think critically. So with this, we then have the question of morality. Who decides what is good or evil? Most people think that they can differentiate between the two by their own conscience. But can you really? Is it okay to lie if the intent is to protect someone's feelings? Is it okay to abandon a commitment to a friend as long as nobody gets hurt and it benefits you? Is it okay to kill someone if it's to save the life of many or a few? Suddenly, right and wrong becomes subjective according to each individual's conscience. This is where things become dangerous, because if we don't trust our own conscience to make these decisions, that's when we wind up handing over more power to the government. And at the top of the government, there's always a figurehead, always a leader who claims more power for themselves. And then they always impose on the needs of the individuals and the people, whether it's against their beliefs or not, because it's always for the greater good. And you look back through history, it's always the same thing. Little bit of infringement, it's for the greater good. People think, okay, we're going to give this power over temporarily. Once you give the government power over you to do something, they never give it back. Ever. Absolute power corrupts absolutely, is a quote from John Dahlberg. Herein lies the second problem, too. At the head of every government is a figure with more influence than others. The power balance always falls to them, who then become a dictator. This system didn't work with kings when we still had kings. It didn't work with Stalin. It didn't work with Hitler. It didn't work with Saddam Hussein. It didn't work with Che Guevara. It always ends in bloodshed and tyranny. And you can sit there and say, well, all those were bad people. If it happened to anyone else, it would wind up being the same way. It's too much power for one person to hold. The collective rule is always paradoxical because it always comes down to one person making the rules and the people that are under the rule being the ones that have to suffer. And when I was writing this, I was writing it on the back of Karl Marx because I think it's important to get out of the echo chamber and to listen to the other side's arguments. I've read Marx's work. Doesn't mean he's a genius. I think the guy's a bloody idiot. He's got this utopia that just doesn't exist, and this is a person who never worked a day in his life. Read his history. He didn't do anything. He was a professional student. It's the same thing with Bernie Sanders. Everyone was pro-Bernie in the States. But he was another one who couch surfed and went around and spent all his time in school, and then he got working for the public dime. He's always been in office. He's never held an actual job. These idealists are people that have never worked in the actual free market. It always comes out to be that way. It seems ironic to me that the more educated and enlightened people become, the further left the pendulum swings, and the more people cry for social justice as opposed to individual justice. The more that I read and the more that I learn, the more that I realize in the grand scheme of things, how little I actually know. Every time I read a book and finish it, I just realize, wow, I had no idea any of that stuff. And it starts to make me think how little I know. There are literally millions of books, and you'll never read them in your lifetime. It's impossible to be an expert on everything. But this is the problem with the government and giving it more powers. People can't know everything, and continually drafting laws that affect citizens they supposedly serve, yet they never consult. So our parliament in Canada is made up of 338 members. 338 members can supposedly speak decisively for the group of 36 million Canadian citizens that they refuse to consult. The number one recommendation when it came to voter reform on the special committee that they formed, talking about it and the way that we vote, was have a referendum. What did the government say? No. They always say no. Anytime a referendum comes up. If you remember when Harper first got into office, he wanted to bring back the issue of abortion and he wanted to bring up same-sex marriage. He wanted to keep putting it to a referendum. And they kept saying no, no, no. When they brought in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, was there a referendum for that? No, there wasn't. When they changed the flag from the red ensign to the maple leaf of Canada, was there a referendum for that? No, there wasn't. When they switched the national anthem from the maple leaf to forever to O Canada, was there a referendum for that? No, it wasn't. When they gender washed the English version of O Canada to get rid of all thy sons, was there a referendum for that? No, there wasn't. The government isn't listening, and they're never going to ask you what you're thinking unless we force them into being accountable. So that's all the more reason why I don't want the government to have any more power. Because they're not asking me. They're not asking anyone. They're doing as they please, and there's no consequence for it. The left seems to just keep screaming these defamatory statements to shut up conservatives. And it's been working. Racist, sexist, bigot, homophobe, xenophobe. Anytime there's an opposing opinion, the left is always standing there screaming at the other side. And I think it's time for the right to not be silenced. I'm not saying that we need to start using these buzzwords and throwing them out at people that have opposite views, but it's time to not be silenced the way that the left will not be silenced. The few brave who are passionate enough about freedom, patriotism, and the need for the most important kind of diversity, intellectual, are always slandered, shouted over, attempted to be silenced by legislation, as we see with hate speech. Now, I don't think anyone should be out talking hate speech, but do I think any form of speech should be illegal? No. No, it shouldn't. Because when you start doing that, you start controlling what people say. And that's kind of the next stop to controlling what people think. And I'm sure I've done it. I know I've done it. You've probably done it too, where you're thinking something, you're like, oh, I shouldn't be thinking that. Now, relaying that and saying out loud isn't a good thing. But when you're starting to feel guilty about the own thoughts you have, you don't even think them out rationally as to why was I thinking that? What caused that? How do I avoid this? You just stop it dead in its tracks. And then you never deal with it. And then it becomes repressed and it can be aggressive. Nobody wants that. Now, whether Canadians are truly apathetic or afraid of speaking out is a questionable thing. However, in an age of post-truth media where debates are held on subjectivism and feelings as opposed to objectivism and empirical data, where universities are crafting safe spaces for adults that can't handle a different opinion, we're running into problems. Something is going wrong. Every child gets a trophy or an award, and there are a spectrum of genders, according to these professors, that are as interchangeable as your socks when you get up in the morning, with no biological proof whatsoever. No empirical evidence, but they're causing this. They're taking it out of the DSM, and they're drafting it into legislation because it's based on feeling, not on fact. Now, I'm sure they're working on this thing. Maybe one day they'll get to the point where they can prove it empirically, but no law should ever be drafted before there is scientific basis for it. Our Prime Minister is something else as well. But he seems to think that the key to reconciliation is segregation. You saw this when he just passed the law giving them funding to have Aboriginal-only schools. We're separating our schools again, and it's the same thing with these spaces where they want certain groups. I want a black-only safe space. White people can't be there. This is segregation. This is so regressive and so backwards, yet the left doesn't seem to catch on to it. Segregation is never the key to anything. And this is our problem. We've given away our culture. We don't have a culture anymore because nobody is forced to assimilate. We are a multicultural country, and diversity is strength. Well, diversity isn't strength when you go to certain areas of certain cities and you can't even communicate with the people because they never learned English or French. We've already got 2 national languages, and a lot of people can't speak either. And I'm talking second and third generations of people. They're coming in and they're staying in communities and they're sticking to themselves. And so you've got Chinatown, you've got Little Italy, you go to Vancouver, you go to Toronto, you go to Ottawa. This happens all over the place. Nobody's assimilating, and our culture is disappearing. Our culture is just whatever they bring from wherever they were. And this is going to destroy the country until we can start bringing people over that are willing to assimilate and fit in, because Canadian culture is a good thing, but who can define it? If you're going to tell me that Canadian culture is Mounties, maple syrup, and poutine, you're nuts. There's more to it than that. We used to have a pride that seems to have just disappeared, and we're getting trampled on, and nobody's keeping up. And I think it's time to bring back a Canadian culture again. So I'm just going to finish up with this. For those that think the way that I do, I implore you to speak up. Whether through social media, letters to your MP, open and candid conversation, bumper stickers, just make your voice heard. Most importantly, don't give up hope. Logic and reason are an uphill battle when it comes to the left in their subjective terms, but it's not too late to change the direction of the country. We need to get into politics and need to be more active, and we need to refuse to be silent the way that the left is refused to be silenced. But it requires immediate and constant action. Political correctness and shaming of opinions have been a powerful weapon for the left for too long. This is the main reason Donald Trump won the election in the States. He's neither a good or a bad thing on his own, but this is a collective pushback of the people saying we've had enough. Now, to those on the other side of the aisle who don't think like I do, I would ask you to speak up to someone that's got a different opinion, and instead of silencing them, hear them out. If they've got good points, go home and think about it. Don't just shut them down and think that you're completely right. Get out of your echo chamber and listen to points on the other side. Read books that oppose your opinion. If you're reading Marx, or if you're reading a lot of these books, go out and pick up 1984 by George Orwell if you haven't read it. It's scary because that's the way that we're headed. Watch V for Vendetta. It's the same type policy. Or read the Gulag Archipelago. It's a hard read, but you'll learn what the dangers of socialism is. But either way, we need to have open and candid conversations on both sides of the aisle. We can't just keep sticking to our individual groups. I think it's important for this because once you start surrounding yourself with the same views, your beliefs never change and you wind up in intellectual stagnation. It's important to learn the view from the other side of the aisle. And with that, I'll leave it be. So I hope you guys had a very good Christmas. Enjoy your New Year's coming up. I'll make another video as soon as I can. Don't drink and drive.